Hi, this is Claude again, and I want to talk with you about Joseph, Old Testament Joseph, the Joseph with a tunic of many colors, Joseph who was the dreamer. And I want to divide this treatment into two parts: the years of preparation and then the years of ruling. The word dysfunctional was invented, not really, but it could have been invented to deal with Joseph's family of orientation. There were two wives to his father, plus a couple of handmaidens, each of whom were used to produce sons. Ultimately, there would be 12 sons coming out of these various couplings. But the inventory really began between the two mothers, between Leah and Rachel. And because Jacob loved Rachel more than he did Leah. So ultimately, this would create problems. But then we've got all the boys present but one, at least in one account, that is Benjamin, the youngest. It doesn't figure in this first part of the story. But Jacob, because he loved Joseph more than the rest of the brothers, and that's a that's a surefire formula for disaster. But he didn't make any bones about letting the world know it. He even made Joseph a special tunic that was we learned it in Sunday school, a coat of many colors, and it actually suggested something of royalty. And Joseph, whether he had the coat before or after the dreams, I'm not quite sure here. But anyway, Joseph had a couple of dreams where in the first one it had all his brothers bowing down to him, and then in the second one had his mother and dad and all of his brothers bowing down to him. So here's a case for hostility developing between the brothers and Joseph. I don't know that Joseph reciprocated their hostility, but he had to bear the brunt of it. So his brothers are off feeding the sheep, and we learn from earlier in the story that Jacob had a whole lot of livestock, and if you know anything at all about sheep, you just can't keep grazing them in the same spot because they take the grass right down to the root. And then that really fouls things up for subsequent growth. So they got to move them around from pasture to pasture. So it was thought that they were at Shechem. So Father Jacob says to Joseph, "Won't you go check on your brothers and see how it is with them?" And so off he goes to where he thought they were. It was at Shechem, but they weren't there. Apparently, they'd already used up the pasture with their sheep there and had moved on to a place called Dothan. And Joseph wouldn't have found this out except for the beneficence of a neighbor who said they've gone to Dothan. So Joseph hikes himself off to Dothan, and when the brothers see him coming from afar off, and they spot that tunic. And boy, I tell you, the murderous thoughts just bubble up in their souls. And they said, "Here comes the dreamer. We can deal with him right now." And so they said, "Let's just kill him." And one of the brothers, Reuben, said, "Hey, let's put him down in a pit." And he didn't tell them that he had the idea that he'd come back a little later and haul Joseph out of the pit and take him back home. But they put him down in a pit, which was actually a dry well. And the scriptures say there was no water in it, and thankfully. And while he's down there, Reuben is away. I don't know what he was doing, checking something on a remote part from where they were, pasturing the sheep. And an Ishmaelite trader band comes by. And so these guys, the brothers say, well, why don't we just sell them to them? And then Joseph's blood won't be on our hands. And so they haul him out of the pit, and they sell him to the Ishmaelites, who are bound for Egypt. Now, these guys don't understand that they were playing into God's hands and wouldn't have had a clue that they were propelling Joseph to his destiny. If they didn't have a clue, you can be sure the old Joseph didn't have a clue. And he was saying, hey, man, what are you guys doing? What are you guys, I wouldn't do this to you. No matter his pleas, they sold him. But providentially, God arranged that down in Egypt, a fellow by the name of Potiphar, who was a captain in Pharaoh's house, if you please, for Potiphar to buy him. And Potiphar was a man of means. He had substance in his fields, and then apparently had quite a household. And the Bible tells us that in nothing flat, Potiphar realized that God's hand was upon Joseph. Now, how in the world he recognized that, I don't know. But now, let's do a little math here to get things clear for subsequent thoughts. We're told Joseph was 17 when he's sold into slavery by his brothers. Then he was 30 when he would come out of Pharaoh's dungeon to interpret dreams. So there's 13 years in between. And we know the last 2 years of Joseph's imprisonment was spent in Pharaoh's dungeon. So we know 2 from 30 gives us age 28. So from 17 to 28, approximately 11 years, Joseph was in Potiphar's household. And this meant that during this time he had to learn the language and learn the customs of the people. And then, having proven himself, and in nothing flat, I don't know, it probably took a couple years. However it was accomplished, Potiphar realized that God's hand was upon Joseph, and so he turned everything over to him. I mean, the field work and the house, I suppose it was a household with many servants. Well, one day all the servants were away, and Potiphar's wife, who had had designs upon Joseph for some time, set upon him and really pressed her claims really hard. And Joseph was left with no option but to hightail it out of there and leaving his garment in the process. And this became the basis of her falsely accusing him of rape. And then from this, as she would give this report to Potiphar, then Potiphar put him into Pharaoh's prison. And Joseph didn't have a clue about what was getting ready to happen. He might have just said, well, here we go again. Well, we'll finish the story in the next segment. Blessings on you.